couple of local cops thought they'd give me a warm welcome to their town. They tied me to a lamppost in the middle of the street, putting on a show like I was just another nobody. Little did they know who they were messing with, or how this would blow up in their face. Let's start from the beginning. Name's Marcus Taylor, 48, and I've been around the block a few times. I recently moved to this quiet little town in Arkansas to take up the badge as the new chief of police. Not my first rodeo. I've seen it all in my 25 years on the force. But this place had a vibe like no other. Everyone knew each other, and they didn't exactly seem thrilled about a new face in charge. It didn't take long to notice the cops here had their own rule book. On my first day before officially reporting in, I thought I'd take a stroll and see what I was dealing with. So there I was, blending in with my worn-out bull cap and old leather jacket. Just another guy on the street. I walked into the local diner, a classic small-town joint with faded signs and vinyl booths that had seen better days. The second I stepped in, I felt a dozen eyes on me. You know the type, the classic "you don't belong here" vibe. Two cops sitting in the corner were laughing their heads off about something, but I could tell I was the punchline. They kept sneaking glances my way, sizing me up like they'd already decided I wasn't worth the time of day, or worse, that I was worth messing with. Their badges practically sparkled under the dim light, but their manners didn't shine nearly as bright. I ordered a coffee, playing it cool, and watched them out of the corner of my eye. I didn't plan to reveal who I was just yet. This was a recon mission. Just as I grabbed my coffee to go, one of them, a tall guy with a wiry frame and a smug grin, barked at me from across the room. "Hey, old man, you lost or something? You sure don't look local." I half turned, keeping my expression neutral. "Just passing through," I replied. Well, clearly they weren't buying it. The tall one, whom I later learned was Officer Jack Price, smirked. "Well, maybe keep passing. Strangers don't last long around here if you get my drift." I shrugged and walked out. But I could feel their eyes on me, watching every step I took. Something told me my new job was going to be way more than paperwork and meetings. The next morning, I decided to go for a jog just outside of town. Fresh air, a bit of peace. It was the perfect way to clear my head. About halfway through, though, I heard the rumble of a patrol car pulling up beside me. Yep, it was them again. Price and his partner, Officer Mike Rawlings, the dynamic duo. Price leaned out of the passenger window, his signature smirk plastered across his face. "Hey, runner, you lost?" The way he said it, you'd think I'd just stumbled into a restricted zone. Rawlings, a stocky guy who looked like he moonlit as a weightlifter, added with a grin, "Yeah, you sure you're welcome around here?" I kept my cool, slowed my pace, and replied, "Just going for a run. Pretty sure that's still allowed, right?" Rawlings chuckled, one of those smug "I know something you don't" laughs. Allowed? Maybe. But strangers don't exactly get the warmest welcome around here, especially those who don't know the rules. Before I could ask what he meant, they both hopped out of the car. Price stepped in close, way too close, and started patting down my pockets, without so much as a "may I?" I took a deep breath, keeping my composure as they rummaged through my jacket. They were throwing smug glances at each other like this was some kind of game. Then Price finally pulled out a random piece of plastic from my pocket, his face lighting up with some twisted excitement. "Well, well, look what we have here," he sneered, holding it up like he'd just solved a major case. "This yours?" I stared at him, not taking the bait. It was obvious they had this little setup planned. By this point I'd had enough of their welcome, but I knew I had to keep my cool. They had no idea who I was, and this wasn't the time for a big reveal. Without explanation, they each grabbed an arm and dragged me toward the center of town. No questions, no reasoning, just dragging me like I was some stray dog. They hauled me right over to the lamppost in the middle of the town square, where folks were milling about their morning routines. "Ladies and gentlemen," Price called out with a mocking bow, "we got ourselves a big city troublemaker here." Rawlings chimed in. "Yeah, looks like he's got a few tricks up his sleeve, or maybe in his pocket." They tied my hands around the lamppost, making a real scene of it. People stopped to watch, some recording on their phones, others shaking their heads. The whole thing was beyond ridiculous. But watching them bask in their little act, I couldn't help but feel a spark of anticipation. These guys had no idea they were setting the stage for their own downfall. And the real show? It was about to begin. Meanwhile, I kept my cool, letting them enjoy their little performance. Jake, ever the showman, clapped his hands together, drawing more attention to their twisted spectacle. "Gotta teach folks like him to respect our town," he said, his voice carrying across the square. Mike chimed in with a laugh, adding, "Yeah, can't have outsiders thinking they can waltz in here and do as they please." The crowd began to shift. Some were clearly uncomfortable, whispering among themselves, while others stayed glued to their phones, recording every second. I noticed a young woman near the edge of the crowd, maybe in her late 20s, holding a baby on her hip. She frowned at Jake and Mike, shaking her head in disapproval, then turned and walked away. She wasn't the only one. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. A few reporters, drawn by the buzz on social media, pushed their way into the square. One of them, a man in his 40s with a sharp suit and a determined look, stepped right up to Mike, holding out a microphone. "Officer, can you explain why this man is tied to a lamppost? What crime has he committed?" Mike blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Jake, overhearing the exchange, strutted over with his trademark smirk. "Look, pal," he said, jabbing a finger toward the reporter, "we know how to run this town. You media types don't get it." But the reporter didn't back down. "Oh, I think the public would like to get it," he said, gesturing to the growing crowd and cameras. "Especially since no one here seems to know what this man has done." By now, Jake and Mike were losing their grip on the crowd. The mood shifted from curiosity to unease, then to outright disapproval. A man in his 60s, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, stepped forward, shaking his head. "This ain't right," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "What happened to due process? What kind of cops are you?" Jake's face flushed, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the air. "Let him go!" It was the young woman with the baby, who had returned with her husband in tow. "This isn't justice, it's a circus," she called out, glaring at Jake and Mike. The pressure was mounting. Jake looked at Mike, and for the first time they seemed unsure of themselves. I decided it was time to put an end to their little act. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I think your audience has seen enough." Jake turned to me, his smirk faltering as I locked eyes with him. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, though his voice had lost its edge. I smiled slightly. "It means you've had your fun, but the show's over. You see, you didn't bother to check who you were dealing with before you tied me up and paraded me around like a trophy." Mike frowned, confusion spreading across his face. "What are you talking about?" With a deliberate movement, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my badge and held it up for the crowd to see. "I'm Marcus Taylor," I said evenly, "your new chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake and Mike's jaws dropped, their faces a mix of disbelief and panic. Around us, the murmurs of the crowd turned into a collective gasp. Phones tilted upward, zooming in on my badge as realization dawned on everyone. "Chief of Police," Mike stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," I replied, stepping forward. "And let me tell you, gentlemen, this little stunt of yours is going to cost you more than just your pride." Jake tried to recover, stammering out an excuse. "We didn't know. Look, it was just a joke." "A joke?" I shot back, my tone icy. "Public humiliation, abuse of power, and violating someone's rights? That's not a joke. That's misconduct." Before either of them could respond, I turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I promise you this. Accountability starts today. Officers like these two don't represent the values of this town or this department. Change is coming." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, while Jake and Mike stood frozen, realizing their time was up. By the end of the day, they were out of the department, their badges and guns surrendered. The town, once complacent, now had its eyes wide open. And me, I was just getting started. Raised an eyebrow, letting Jake's words hang in the air like a bad joke. "Tradition," I repeated, my voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "So, you're telling me you have a tradition of humiliating people, of abusing your power to keep outsiders in line?" Jake shifted uncomfortably but tried to hold his ground. "It's harmless fun," he muttered, though his confidence was wavering. I took a step closer, narrowing the space between us. "Harmless?" I said, my tone low but firm. "Tell me, Jake, how many people have been on the receiving end of your so-called fun? How many have walked away feeling powerless, humiliated, or worse? This isn't tradition, it's abuse, plain and simple." Mike, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, though his voice was much less confident. "Chief, we didn't mean any harm. We were just—" I cut him off with a sharp look. "You were just what, Mike? Having fun? Making an example of someone you assumed was beneath you? Let me tell you something. This ends today." The room was deathly silent. The rest of the team stood frozen, their eyes darting between Jake, Mike, and me. I could feel the weight of their judgment shifting, their allegiance cracking, as they realized the gravity of the situation. "Jake," I continued, turning my full attention back to him, "do you know what a real tradition is? It's service, it's respect, it's earning the trust of the community you're supposed to protect. What you've been doing isn't just unprofessional, it's a disgrace to that badge." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to silence him. "Enough. I've seen all I need to see." I turned to address the rest of the team, raising my voice so everyone could hear me clearly. "Let me make this perfectly clear. This department will not tolerate abuse of power, discrimination, or any behavior that disrespects the people of this town. Not on my watch. If you think you can't work within those boundaries, there's the door." I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 papers, their termination forms. With deliberate precision, I signed them in front of the entire room. Then, I turned back to Jake and Mike and extended the forms toward them. "Hand over your badges and your weapons. Effective immediately, you're both relieved of duty." Jake's face turned pale as he stared at the papers. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. "I'm dead serious," I replied. "You wanted to put on a show? Well, congratulations, gentlemen. You're about to be the stars of a very different kind of spotlight." Reluctantly, they removed their badges and guns, placing them on the table with trembling hands. The rest of the team watched in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room like a heavy fog. As Jake and Mike walked out of the station, heads low, I addressed the team one last time. "This isn't just about 2 officers who crossed the line. This is about building a department that serves and protects everyone, without bias, without cruelty. If you have a problem with that, you know where to find me." I paused, letting my words sink in, before turning and walking back to my office. The atmosphere in the station was different now, quieter, heavier, but it was a necessary change. The days of unchecked power and toxic traditions were over. Outside, the crowd that had gathered began to cheer as Jake and Mike emerged from the station, their disgraced exit filmed by the same cameras that had captured their so-called fun. The local news stations were all over the story, and the town was already buzzing with calls for reform. By the next morning, the fallout had reached beyond our small town. State officials were calling for an investigation, while community leaders organized meetings to discuss how we could rebuild trust between the department and the people we served. For the first time, it felt like real change was possible. I sat in my office that evening, watching the news coverage of the incident. The image of Jake and Mike tying me to that lamppost played on a loop, a stark reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. But more importantly, it was a symbol of what we were leaving behind. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. And as I leaned back in my chair, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, I knew we were heading in the right direction. As the dust began to settle, the ripple effects of the scandal continued to spread. Calls flooded into the station from neighboring towns, state officials, and even civil rights organizations. People wanted to know how a department could have gone so far off the rails, and they demanded assurances that real reform was on the horizon. I spent the following weeks in back-to-back meetings with community leaders, local activists, and legal representatives. They all had the same goal: to ensure that what Jake and Mike had done would never happen again. It was clear that this wasn't just about 2 bad cops. It was about rebuilding trust in a system that had failed its people for far too long. The first step was transparency. I called for a complete audit of the department, bringing in an independent review board to assess every aspect of how we operated, from hiring practices to the handling of complaints. Nothing was off limits. I wanted the community to see that we weren't just sweeping this under the rug. We were starting fresh, even if it meant exposing some uncomfortable truths. At the same time, we launched mandatory training programs for all officers. These weren't the superficial checkbox sessions that some departments use to cover their bases. These were in-depth workshops on de-escalation tactics, cultural competency, and understanding systemic bias. I made it clear that participation wasn't optional. If you wanted to wear the badge in this town, you had to prove you were worthy of it. While these changes were being implemented, the community began to heal in its own way. Town hall meetings turned into productive discussions, where residents shared their experiences and voiced their concerns. For the first time, people felt like their voices were being heard, and that alone began to restore a sense of hope. Jake and Mike, meanwhile, faced the full brunt of the legal system. The mountain of evidence against them left little room for doubt, and the court didn't hesitate to make an example of them. They were convicted on multiple counts of misconduct, and their sentences were a stark reminder that no one is above the law. For the victims who had suffered under their so-called traditions, it was a long overdue moment of validation. One afternoon, a young woman named Carla approached me outside the station. She couldn't have been more than 25, but the weight she carried in her expression made her seem older. She told me about an encounter she'd had with Jake and Mike years ago, how they'd humiliated her in front of her friends for no reason other than their own amusement. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she said, her voice breaking. "But now I know things are changing." Her words stuck with me. They reminded me why I'd taken this job in the first place, to make a difference, not just for the people who lived here now, but for everyone who would call this town home in the future. Carla's story, and the stories of so many others like her, were the driving force behind every decision I made moving forward. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the town began to shift. Officers who had once looked the other way were now stepping up, eager to be part of the change. New recruits came in, selected not just for their qualifications, but for their character and commitment to justice. The department slowly began to reflect the values it was meant to uphold. One evening, as I was locking up my office, I noticed a group of kids playing in the square where Jake and Mike had once tied me to that lamppost. They were laughing, carefree, completely oblivious to the weight that space had once carried. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about how far we'd come. I stood there for a while, watching them chase each other under the streetlights. The town wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was on its way to becoming something better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a deep sense of pride, not just in what we'd accomplished, but in what we were building for the future. This wasn't the end of the story. There would always be challenges, always more work to do, but for now it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. As I walked to my car, I took one last look at the square, a quiet smile crossing my face. The fight wasn't over, but we were winning, and that was enough to keep me going. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for integrity, accountability, and the courage to challenge the status quo. In my life, whether in professional or personal contexts, the lesson is clear. Silence in the face of injustice only perpetuates harm. Like the protagonist who took deliberate steps to enact change within the system, I can apply this principle by addressing issues directly, advocating for transparency, and refusing to accept tradition as an excuse for unethical behavior. If you ever find yourself in a position where you witness wrongdoing or complacency, remember that real change starts with action, no matter how small. It might mean speaking up in a meeting, supporting someone who's been wronged, or simply refusing to compromise your values. As the story demonstrates, it takes effort, resilience, and consistency, but the result, a community built on respect and fairness, is worth every challenge. The key is to lead with purpose, listen to those affected, and never underestimate the ripple effect your actions can have in inspiring others to do the same.